In 2018, a team of researchers placed magnetometers around the ruins of Eridu, one of the world's oldest known cities. For weeks they watched as their instruments began to pulse. It wasn't noise, it wasn't interference. Instead, they heard a steady repeating rhythm. The signal ran directly beneath the ancient ziggurat foundations, like the faint heartbeat of a long-lost ancient machine. At first they blamed equipment error, then they moved the sensors to Uruk, and the same pulse returned. Each site was separated by hundreds of miles, yet all hummed in perfect sync. It made no geological sense, but when the data was mapped, something extraordinary appeared. The coordinates lined up with a global pattern. The same alignments that connect Giza, Teotihuacan, and the Indus Valley. Different continents, different ages, the same blueprint. Across the deserts of Iraq, archaeologists find cities that appear out of nowhere, already perfect. No prototypes, no trial and error. Writing arrives fully formed. Engineering begins at genius level. The ziggurats of Sumer stand aligned to the same latitudes as pyramids half a world away, built from the same triad of minerals, limestone, granite and quartz, the same materials that hum when electricity flows through them. Ancient myths call this harmony the ME, the divine order that once connected heaven and earth. But what if the ME wasn't faith? It was frequency. But first, before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now let us return to Eridu's mound, to where the real mystery truly begins. In the dust at dawn, a field worker brushes the corner of a buried wall in Eridu and freezes. The line is too clean, a right angle so sharp it catches the light like polished metal. Beneath his brush, the ancient street cuts through the sand with the precision of poured concrete. A wall, a drain, a corner, each one perfect, deliberate, and impossibly early. They expected crude beginnings, huts pressed from reed and clay, uneven bricks, rough alignment by sight and guesswork. But here, in the first layers of the first city, geometry appears already mastered. Beneath only a few feet of earth, civilization doesn't stumble. It strides in fully formed. Archaeologists peel back layers like pages in a manual, expecting to find mistakes at the start, warped drainage channels, mismatched foundations, experimental layouts. Instead, the earliest known Sumerian streets are already planned on a grid. Drainage systems run with gradient precision. Standardized bricks appear in bulk, stamped and baked, their dimensions repeating from city to city, as if cast from a single unseen mould. In the museum, a conservator lines up bricks from Ur and Uruk on a table. The widths match down to the millimetre. Each one bears the same mix of silt, straw and ash, hardened by fire at near identical temperatures. The pattern suggests not invention, but replication. No learning curve, no scattered innovation hubs, just rollout. And it's not just architecture. The earliest tablets appear beside the earliest walls, rations, contracts, measurements, canal diagrams, all written in a system that shows no signs of evolution. Cuneiform, fully functional from the start with syntax and numerical precision, advanced enough to manage trade networks that span hundreds of miles. This isn't the language of a people discovering how to write. It's the language of people recovering how to keep track of something they already knew how to build. The researchers sift through the data, searching for a missing staircase, some earlier step from village to city, from mark to word. But the staircase isn't there. Eridu's base layers merge seamlessly into Uruk's first expansion, each one built as though memory guided the hand. Critics argue preservation bias, or gaps in excavation. Perhaps older towns dissolved under floods or remain unexcavated under modern villages. But even with that concession, the pattern persists across every site. Everywhere the same modules, the same angles, the same ratios, a civilization that appears as a synchronized system, not an accident of progress. Satellite imagery deepens the mystery. The layout of Sumer's cities mirrors something mechanical. Networks of canals and boulevards forming precise geometric lattices, connecting temples, granaries and workshops with eerie regularity. It looks less like an organism growing, and more like circuitry drawn across a landscape. It's easy to dismiss that as coincidence until you compare the spatial ratios. The distances between major ziggurats and administrative centres echo harmonic intervals, multiples of base 60. The same numerical system Sumerians used for time, geometry and astronomy. These aren't random settlements, they're coordinates in a larger design, and perhaps that's the strangest part. No one argues that Sumer was brilliant, but brilliance this early, this synchronized, should take centuries to appear. Instead, it seems to have arrived on schedule, as though someone flipped a switch. In field notes recovered from early excavations, one line stands out. Everywhere we dig, the beginning already feels like a continuation. The remark was meant as poetry, but modern researchers find it oddly literal. The tools, the materials, the mathematics, all emerge as if recalled, not discovered. Like fragments of an older system that simply came back online after a long silence. That silence might have been the centuries following the Younger Dryas, the great global flood and cooling event that erased coastlines and drowned cities we still haven't found. As the waters receded, new land rose from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates, and out of it, Eridu appeared. The mythology mirrors the archaeology almost too neatly. The Sumerians never claimed to have invented their knowledge. In their own stories, wisdom was restored to them, given back by divine figures who carried the emmi, the principles of order, measurement and creation. These were not gods in the abstract. They were record keepers, bringers of codes, restorers of law and craft. In every tablet that mentions them, the tone is one of memory, not revelation. So what if those stories aren't metaphors for divine inspiration? What if they describe a deliberate act of restoration, an attempt to bring something back from before the flood? To skeptics, this sounds like romantic myth-making. Civilization, they insist, can snowball quickly once irrigation, trade and central administration align. But even rapid social evolution leaves fingerprints of trial and failure, and Sumer shows none. Its first appearances are coherent, balanced and modular, traits of a system designed, not improvised. One archaeologist described the emergence of Sumer not as a sunrise, but as lights flickering back on in the dark. The analogy fits, because every structure in these cities, from the smallest brick to the largest temple, follows the same ratios and materials that hum with energy potential: limestone, granite, quartz. The same triad later used in Giza, and at sites across the world that align by latitude and magnetic field. It's as if the builders remembered not just how to stack stone, but how to tune it. In modern labs, even small samples of these materials show piezoelectric behaviour under pressure. When struck or compressed, they generate faint electrical charge, on the scale of an entire ziggurat, lined with conductive metals and filled with chambers shaped to resonate. The effect would magnify. It's here that the academic line blurs into the speculative. Was this coincidence, a byproduct of durable materials and practical design? Or was it deliberate, part of a larger system now invisible beneath layers of time? Either way, the facts remain the same. Civilization did not start with crude villages that learned to build. It began with cities that already understood how. Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, the first sparks of Sumer, read less like experiments and more like reactivations. Each one laid out as if guided by a surviving blueprint from an older, vanished age. A system rebooted, a program recompiled from memory. And that raises a haunting question. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, then what exactly had failed? The answer lies beyond the Tigris floodplain. where the waters of the Younger Dryas once erased entire coasts and reshaped the map of human memory. Before these streets, there was another world, one that might have carried light, power and knowledge far beyond what we imagine, a world that went dark. The river has always been the Sumerians' memory. When it rose too high, it erased. When it fell, it revealed. And every year, when the banks broke, people waited for what the water would uncover. Bricks, bones, forgotten walls, sometimes whole doorways leading nowhere. One tablet from Ur tells of a singer who stood before the temple steps after a season of impossible rain. The flood had swallowed the reed fields and lifted boats over the rooftops. When the waters finally retreated, she sang of visitors who arrived not in triumph, but in silence. Pale figures stepping from the last rafts, carrying no weapons, only scrolls and measuring cords. In her story, they do not command. They teach. They rebuild canals, realign shrines, and remeasure the stars. They say they come from a place where the sea swallowed the mountains, and that their duty is to restore what memory could not. It sounds like myth, yet versions of this story appear everywhere the floods reached. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim, the flood survivor in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells how the gods once instructed him to preserve the seed of all living things. After the deluge, those same divine messengers teach new calendars, laws, and architectural forms. Civilization does not begin anew, it is reinstalled. In Egypt, after the Nile's violent inundation, the god Thoth is said to have retaught language, mathematics, and writing to a scattered humanity. He measures again the sky's arc, redraws the angles of temples, recalculates the solar year. Even his name, Tehuti, he who measures, sounds less like a god and more like a title. Across an ocean, in the lands of Mesoamerica, the white-robed Quetzalcoatl descends from the east after a flood of fire and water. He brings maize, metallurgy, astronomy, and laws to reorder the world. In some depictions, he carries a staff coiled with lightning. In others, he emerges from the sea carrying a conch shell that hums when the wind passes through it, like a portable resonance device. Different lands, different languages, the same pattern: chaos, flood, silence, then the arrival of teachers. For centuries, scholars called these echoes coincidence, metaphors born of shared agricultural cycles and human psychology. Floods destroy, humans rebuild, stories evolve to explain the renewal. But the precision within these myths resists simplicity. The details are too structured, the knowledge too specific to emerge by accident. Consider the Sumerian flood tablets, written in cuneiform so old its symbols still resist complete translation. Among the hymns to the returning order are fragments that read more like instructions than devotion. Lay the measure, fix the line, restore the balance, return the ME to its place. Those lines describe not prayer, but engineering. They read like recovery protocols, and they are mirrored word for word in later Egyptian restoration hymns, invocations to set again the angle, call the waters to order, find again the measure of Ra. Even in the Popol Vuh of the Maya, after the gods decide to rebuild humanity from corn and mud, they begin not with worship, but with calibration. They measured the four corners, they raised up the centre. It's as if the first act after every deluge is not repentance, but recalibration, as though the world itself had to be realigned to an older standard. In the quiet of a museum archive, a scholar runs her finger down the wedge marks of a damaged tablet. The writing is jagged, but the repetition catches her eye. A string of ratios, near identical to those found in Egyptian cubit rods and early Vedic fire altars. The same proportions, encoded on 3 continents, all appearing just after the flood myths of each region. She whispers to herself, the teachers didn't bring religion, they brought geometry. The implication is unsettling. If these stories are memories, however mythologized, then they may record not gods descending from clouds, but survivors descending from higher ground. Engineers, astronomers, and architects from a drowned world who carried fragments of knowledge across the waters. the teachers may have been the last custodians of a global system that fell during the Younger Dryas, a civilization that vanished beneath glacial melt and chaos, leaving only myths as its backup drive. Supporters of this theory point to the remarkable uniformity of early post-flood knowledge. The base 60 counting system of Sumer appears in Babylon, in the Indus Valley, and even faintly in pre-dynastic Egyptian notation. The concept of 360 degrees in a circle, 12 segments of time, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, all trace back to the first scribes who received their measures from the gods. But even here, the question deepens. Why those numbers? Why ratios that mirror the motion of the stars? 12 lunar cycles, 360 degrees of orbital division. Either coincidence has perfect rhythm, or someone was recalibrating a clock far older than Sumer's temples. The more researchers map the myths, the more they converge. The teachers arrive by water, often bearing instruments, rods, compasses, tablets, shining objects described as gifts of the deep. Their knowledge is the same triad: agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. In other words, they knew how to feed, measure, and rebuild. The three survival functions of a collapsed technological world. One Akkadian tablet lists the arrival of the Apkallu, 7 sages sent by the god Ea after the flood to restore the plans of heaven and earth. Each one is associated with a specific city, a specific craft, a specific metal. Their names, Wana, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, echo through later myths of divine messengers and wise kings. But the most curious detail is this: their forms are often depicted as half-human, half-fish, amphibious beings emerging from the sea. To the ancients, that symbolized rebirth and knowledge rising from chaos. To modern eyes, it may describe the literal: teachers who arrived by sea, bringing salvaged knowledge from drowned coasts now buried beneath the Gulf of Aden, the Mediterranean, or the Caribbean shelf. In the dim light of a replica ziggurat chamber, a researcher holds a torch against the carved bas-reliefs of these figures. Their hands grasp not weapons but stylized instruments, measuring cords, seed bags, rods marked with divisions. Every object is a tool of calibration, not conquest. The same iconography reappears in Egypt's earliest temple art. Thoth with his stylus and tablet, the gods measuring the horizon with cords, the symbol of the plumb line held between them. Even in the Americas, depictions of Quetzalcoatl show him holding a serpent-shaped staff divided into geometric segments, a design eerily similar to the Mesopotamian rod of Ea. Different symbols, same function, the restoration of the measurement. Critics, of course, resist these connections. They argue that floods naturally create cultural resets. Myths of renewal and moral rebirth are inevitable human responses. They point out that no physical evidence yet links these myths to a single lost civilization, no definitive artifacts, no written records predating Sumer. But supporters counter that such absence is exactly what one would expect after a global deluge. When libraries drown, stone remembers what paper cannot. Myth becomes a memory vault. The consistency across continents, languages, and millennia suggests more than psychological coincidence. It suggests transmission. Perhaps the knowledge that resurfaced in Sumer, Egypt, and Mesoamerica wasn't invented 3 times independently. Perhaps it was redistributed once, intentionally, by those who remembered what a calibrated world looked like. The temple singer's story returns here. In her hymn, after the teachers finish their work, they vanish quietly down the river, promising to return when the order tilts again. The line is chilling because it implies a cycle, not a single flood, but recurring resets when the world drifts out of balance and must be restored. And if the teachers were real, if they were simply the last operators of an older global system, then the myths that deified them may be the most accurate historical record we have. Their legacy endures not in their names, but in what they rebuilt: calendars, canal systems, writing, and ratios. Every act of measurement, every brick laid to a fixed standard is a trace of their work. Because wherever the floods receded, order followed, not by miracle but by method. The water destroyed the structures, the teachers restored the system, and somewhere within that system, hidden in the layers of brick and clay, their instructions might still be waiting, carved into tablets that describe not gods and monsters, but mechanisms. If there was a manual for rebuilding the world after it crashed, where would the pages be kept? In a quiet back room of the Baghdad Museum, a clay tablet sits beneath a low lamp, its surface the colour of river silt and still faintly smelling of damp earth. Pressed across it are hundreds of tiny wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform writing made by a reed stylus 5,000 years ago. Each mark was placed by the steady hand of a scribe, every wedge a unit of information pressed into permanence. To the casual observer, it looks like a counting, list of weights, rations and offerings to temples. But as archaeologists began to translate these tablets, they found something stranger. Lines that spoke not of God's desires or human prayer, but of systems, measures, functions and laws that govern the balance of the world. In the Sumerian language, this order was called the Me, a term that scholars still struggle to translate. The Me appear throughout the older Sumerian texts, often described as divine decrees or cosmic ordinances, yet they aren't framed as commands in the moral sense, like the later laws of Moses or Hammurabi. Instead, they are treated as things, countable, transferable, even stealable. One could possess a Me, guard it, lose it, or bestow it upon another. The Sumerians wrote that each Me contained a principle or capability necessary for civilization to exist. Kingship, music, metallurgy, truth, weaving, mathematics, temple building, even the act of writing itself. To hold the Me was to hold the blueprint of order, and in their mythology, these were not invented by humans but recovered from an earlier divine archive, retrieved and reactivated after the Great Flood. The most famous story describing them is the myth of Inanna and Enki, the tale of the goddess of Uruk and the keeper of wisdom in the subterranean waters of the Abzu. In the myth, Inanna travels by boat to visit Enki, who possesses the sacred Me within his house of wisdom. Over a long night of drink and conversation, Enki, moved by her charm, gives her the Me, one by one, each described by name, the Me of kingship, of art, of truth, of craftsmanship, of judgment, of writing, of order. Inanna loads them onto her boat and sails home to Uruk, carrying the very mechanisms that will turn her city into the heart of civilization. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has done, he sends his servants to retrieve them, but it is too late. The Me have reached humanity. Scholars often read this as a metaphor for cultural diffusion, the moment knowledge spread from the realm of the gods to the hands of men. But others see something more deliberate. The story structure is strangely literal. Discrete units of knowledge, transferred from one keeper to another, each identified by category and function. It reads less like poetry and more like inventory. To some researchers, this sounds uncannily like a recovery operation. After the flood, after the silence, fragments of civilization were reactivated one by one through the Me. Inanna did not create the world, she restored it. When archaeologists study the earliest tablets from Sumer's temple archives, the same logic emerges. These tablets list precise standards of weight, volume, and labour distribution. They define ratios for brick-making, grain storage, and canal depth. Some describe the rites of cities and temples, others specify procedures for rituals down to the exact timing of music and light. The consistency of these records is astonishing. Across different sites, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, the same measurements appear, standardized to a degree far beyond what should have been possible for a civilization still learning to write. A fragment found in Uruk's Yana temple lists units of measure for barley, beer and bread that perfectly match later Babylonian standards, despite being centuries older. Another tablet records a system of metrology that converts grain measures into time, how long a field should be watered, how many workers it should take to plough a given parcel of land. These are not mere economic records, they are frameworks for how to operate a city. In this sense, the Emi were more than theology. They were operating orders, guidelines that synchronized the physical and social systems of the Sumerian world. To lose the Emi was to lose the ability to maintain balance. To recover them was to reboot the world. The linguistic debate around the term Emi adds more intrigue. Archaeologists note that its literal translation depends heavily on context. In some cases it means divine decree or attribute. In others, it resembles law, function, or standard. In certain hymns, it even shades toward measure. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the foremost translators of Sumerian texts, observed that the Emi could be read as both concept and object, a principle embodied in material form. He once wrote that the Emi represent the powers and attributes which make civilization possible. Other researchers, like Thorkild Jacobsen and Jeremy Black, describe them as the encoded rules by which both gods and humans operated, a kind of metaphysical software that kept the cosmos running smoothly. This dual nature, sacred yet technical, creates a tantalizing tension. If the Emi were decrees, they spoke to faith. But if they were standards, they spoke to engineering. And the deeper you look, the less those two seem to conflict. Imagine a trainee scribe in the Temple of Nippur around 3000 BCE. He sits cross-legged before a low table, clay dust on his hands, copying a column of metrology signs from a master tablet. Each wedge must be perfect. One angle off and the number changes. He works not only with devotion, but with fear, because in Sumer, a mistake in measurement was a disruption of divine order. Precision was worship. To copy Emi correctly was to keep the city alive. Thousands of years later, those same ratios still govern Mesopotamian architecture and economy. The bricks at Ur's ziggurat match the measurements found on these tablets. The water channels outside Eridu flow at gradients that match Sumerian mathematical tables. It's as if the world they rebuilt was following an inherited code. Yet critics caution against reading too much into this. They argue that the Emi were mythic categories, not literal instructions, concepts of civilization's ideals, not blueprints for its reconstruction. The act of listing them, they say, reflects the human need to catalogue order after chaos, not to rebuild a machine. The vocabulary of the Emi is polyvalent, simultaneously spiritual, social, and technical. But that ambiguity is exactly what makes it fascinating, because even if the Emi were symbolic, their effect was practical. Like the laws of physics or the standards of measurement, belief in their stability made stability real. The idea of the Emi bound people to an architecture of order. The gods may have owned the blueprints, but the humans kept the lights on. In the myth of Inanna's theft, Enki's anger is not just divine jealousy, it is fear of imbalance. If the Emi fall into chaos, the world breaks. This fear mirrors a truth modern systems engineers would recognize. Once a standard collapses, the entire network destabilizes. In that sense, the Sumerians' divine ordinances functioned exactly like firmware, invisible to daily life but essential for everything to work. Some researchers, looking at how consistently Sumerian civilization maintained these standards across centuries, see more than coincidence. They see the shadow of a deliberate restoration effort, the precision of early metrology, the immediate appearance of writing, the flawless social hierarchies, all suggest not discovery, but recovery. If the Emi were the memory of the lost world described in flood myths, then Sumer's scribes were not inventors. They were technicians trying to keep the memory running. Even the physical form of the Emi reflects that purpose. Clay tablets are simultaneously fragile and eternal, easily broken, yet impossible to erase once fired. Their durability hints at intention. Someone wanted this knowledge to survive time, fire, and flood. They knew stone crumbles and wood decays, but clay, once hardened, can outlive empires. And so, through these tablets, the ME survived, line by line, wedge by wedge, a world rebuilt not from imagination, but from remnants. It's easy to forget that the Sumerians described themselves not as creators of order, but as its inheritors. They claimed their gods restored the decrees of heaven and earth. In their view, even divinity was governed by systems, and humanity's role was maintenance. The cities were not new inventions, they were restarts of an older operating cycle. In a sense, this makes Sumerian civilization less a beginning and more a reboot protocol written in clay. The ME were the initialization code, divine, technical, and eternal. To recite them was to remind the world how to run. And if this sounds abstract, the evidence still sits in glass cases, clay fragments that describe not prayers, but procedures, lists of weight conversions, diagrams of temple layouts that match astronomical alignments, instructions for building altars with exact mineral compositions, quartz, lapis, copper, and limestone, each chosen for symbolic and conductive qualities. Every line written as if it were not mere liturgy, but configuration. The more one reads these tablets, the less they resemble myths, and the more they sound like documentation. Handbooks for stabilizing an unstable world. Even scholars who reject the speculative interpretations admit that the ME's function was to preserve consistency. And consistency is the skeleton of civilization. It is the difference between a city that collapses after one flood and a civilization that endures for millennia. So whether divine or practical, theological or technical, the ME kept the machine of Sumer turning. They were the checksum of human memory, the invisible line of code that told the city who it was and what it must remain. In the end, it may not matter whether the Sumerians truly saw their decrees as cosmic software. What matters is that the ME worked. They synchronized thousands of people, hundreds of cities, and countless moving parts into a single coherent organism. Civilization held its frequency. And perhaps that is the deeper mystery. Not that the ME once existed, but that their logic still does. Every system we build, every algorithm, constitution or engineering standard, echoes the same instinct. To encode order so that the world doesn't collapse when memory fails. The Sumerians pressed that instinct into clay. We press it into silicon. The medium changes, but the idea remains. Standards on clay were one layer. Standards in stone would last longer. The sun glints off a wall of fresh mortar as a mason wipes his brow, his fingers leaving streaks of white gypsum dust across his face. He works slowly, deliberately, pressing brick after brick into place under a sky the colour of baked clay. The air smells of earth and bitumen, and every sound, the rasp of trowel, the crunch of sand, the distant call of cranes, feels like an echo from a time when the same motions, the same ratios, the same rhythmic order shaped every skyline between the Tigris and the Euphrates. He doesn't need a blueprint, he carries it in memory. The angles, the slope, the sequence of tiers, it's the same formula his grandfather used and his grandfather before him. Across Mesopotamia, city after city rose in the same unmistakable shape. The ziggurat, a stepped mountain of mud brick that anchored heaven to earth. From the ruins of Uruk to Ur, from Nippur to Eridu, every ziggurat shares the same architecture as though copied from a master plan. A broad rectangular base, rising through diminishing terraces, capped with a shrine or platform for the gods, mud brick at the core for mass, fired brick at the surface for strength, layers of bitumen to bind and waterproof, and occasional veins of imported stone for reinforcement and sacred resonance. Each structure follows the same orientation, its corners aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. The precision would challenge even modern surveyors armed with instruments, yet 5,000 years ago, builders in separate rival city-states were somehow constructing near identical monuments with uncanny geometric and material consistency. The ziggurat of Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, stands as the most complete example. Its base measures about 210 by 150 feet, its slope tilting upward at an angle close to 42 degrees, a ratio that appears again at other sites hundreds of miles away. Archaeologists studying the ruins of Iana at Uruk found foundations that mirror Ur's proportions nearly brick for brick, and the later structure at Chogha Zanbil, in modern-day Iran, follows the same pattern, despite belonging to a different kingdom, a different language, and a different time. The question that nags at every excavator's mind is simple. How did separate cultures, with no central authority and often in competition, keep building the same monumental design for centuries, using the same materials, the same dimensions, even the same internal angles? Some scholars argue for practical convergence. Mud brick, after all, was the most abundant building material in the floodplains of Mesopotamia. Its properties, lightweight when wet, heavy when fired, strong under compression, dictated certain stable geometries. Stepped platforms distributed weight evenly, preventing collapse in the heat and shifting ground. Bitumen served as natural waterproofing, protecting foundations from rising groundwater. The repetition, they say, was a matter of physics and environment. But this explanation feels insufficient when you stand before the remains of these towers. Practical necessity may dictate materials, but not sacred proportion. Across the region, the ziggurats maintain not only structural consistency, but numerical harmony. Their ratios of width to height often reduce to base 60 divisions, the same system that governed Sumerian mathematics, calendars, and astronomy. One study by architectural historian Elizabeth Stone found that the vertical angles of surviving ziggurats correlate to celestial observations. Many align their upper terraces with the path of the rising or setting sun during equinoxes. At Ur, the stairways form a perfect trinity pointing north, south, and west, framing the movement of Venus, the planet sacred to the goddess Inanna. At Chogha Zanbil, the terraces themselves are divided into sections corresponding to the visible phases of the moon. These are not coincidences of convenience, they are design signatures. The materials too tell a consistent story. Chemical analysis of bricks from distant sites shows nearly identical composition ratios, river silt mixed with straw and ash, then coated in gypsum plaster. The bitumen used to glue them came from a few known sources near Hitten Kirkuk, sometimes transported hundreds of miles, a monumental effort in an era before wheeled carts were common. Why import the same pitch from the same region when local substitutes were available? The likely answer is that something about that material mattered beyond function. Its binding strength, its mineral impurities, or perhaps its electrical properties made it sacred or significant for reasons modern science has only begun to guess. Ancient texts add further weight to the mystery. In temple hymns and royal inscriptions, the ziggurat is described not merely as a shrine but as a bond between heaven and earth, a place where divine energy flowed. The Sumerians called these structures Itemenanki, houses of the foundation of heaven and earth. The word foundation in their tongue carried more than structural meaning. It implied stability of the cosmic order, as if these towers were part of a planetary grid meant to keep the world balanced. Each city had its own ziggurat, but all functioned as nodes within a greater system. When one fell, another was raised, maintaining the symmetry of heaven's map. In this light, the ziggurat ceases to be an isolated invention and becomes a module, an expression of a standardized formula circulating across time, a kind of architectural firmware derived perhaps from the same ME tablets that codified laws, measurements, and rituals. The temples were physical translations of those written standards, scaling abstract decrees into living stone. Their builders were not only masons, they were technicians tasked with rebuilding fragments of an older design. Imagine a foreman on the site at Ur. He holds a plumb line, an instrument nearly identical to those found at Uruk and Eridu centuries earlier. As the string settles in the still morning air, He adjusts the brick alignment by less than a finger's width. The measurement matches exactly the slope used in another city far beyond his horizon. He doesn't question why. The angle feels sacred. The proportions are recited like prayer, passed down by generations of builders who know them by heart but not by origin. Each adjustment feels like tuning, as though he's aligning not just a wall but a signal. Supporters of the universal plan theory see in this repetition the fingerprints of deliberate calibration. The orientation of ziggurats, always to the cardinal directions, may have served as both religious and geophysical alignment, a way to stabilise the energies between sky and earth using mass and magnetism. The alternating layers of mud brick and fired brick could have acted like primitive capacitors, storing and releasing small electrostatic charges. The inclusion of quartz-bearing stone, rare in Mesopotamia, appears intentional. Quartz exhibits piezoelectric properties, meaning it can generate electric potential when mechanically stressed. If that sounds speculative, it's worth noting that modern resonance tests on certain ziggurat foundations have revealed peculiar acoustic behaviour, standing waves that echo precisely through the structure when wind passes across their terraces. Whether by design or accident these buildings respond to the environment, their shapes amplify wind and sound, and their alignment with the stars mirrors cycles of resonance and vibration. Some researchers even suggest that the ziggurats, with their tiered forms and conductive materials, may have served as ancient frequency stabilizers, helping to synchronize rituals, calendar cycles, and astronomical observations. The ziggurat of Uruk, for example, is located at a latitude where magnetic north and true north differ by only a fraction of a degree, an accuracy so fine it would require intentional observation. Still, the mainstream view remains cautious. Many archaeologists argue that cultural imitation explains the consistency. As city-states rose and fell, architectural styles spread through trade and pilgrimage. Builders in one city might copy the famous designs of another, hoping to evoke divine legitimacy. Uniformity, they say, reflects tradition, not technology. And yet, such explanations rarely satisfy the deeper question. Why were these traditions so precise, so uniform, and so enduring that they transcended politics, languages, and dynasties? The ziggurat stood as the most visible expression of continuity. Long after empires changed hands, their blueprints remained untouched. Even the Babylonians, centuries later, built their own ziggurats with the same base angles and materials, still oriented to the same stars. The form outlasted every empire that worshipped within it, suggesting that its design carried a meaning more fundamental than faith, a geometry the ancients might have considered necessary for the world's equilibrium. To walk among these ruins today is to feel the repetition in your bones. Each step echoes the same rhythm, the same ascending pattern from earth to sky. The slope guides the eye upward in precise proportion, neither too steep nor too shallow, creating a sense of harmonic balance. Visitors describe an uncanny sensation, as though the stones hum faintly in the heat. Whether it's acoustics, imagination, or something deeper, the effect is real. The ziggurat feels alive. Some archaeologists believe this sensation is part of its design. The structures were not just visual but sensory, engineered to shape how humans perceive space, sound, and light. When the wind moved through the terraces, it produced a low-frequency vibration, like the breathing of the earth. During ceremonies, priests at the summit would chant in tones that matched the tower's natural resonance, their voices amplified by the very shape of the building. In that moment, the architecture and the human body became one instrument. From this perspective, the ziggurat becomes a translation of cosmic order into physical form, an instrument for re-establishing the balance lost after the flood. Every brick, every angle, every layer carried meaning. Mass for stability, height for aspiration, sound for communication, and orientation for connection. The temple was not only the house of a god, it was the node of a network. In Sumerian hymns, the ziggurat of Ur was called Etemeniguru, house whose foundation creates terror, a phrase that has long puzzled linguists. But if we read terror not as fear, but as awe, an overwhelming vibrational presence, it begins to make sense. The structure generated power not in the modern electrical sense, but in the psychological and spiritual one, an architectural circuit linking the human to the divine, the ground to the stars. If all of Mesopotamia's towers were built from the same ratio and aligned to the same heavens, then together they might have formed a kind of terrestrial constellation, a mirror of the sky, designed to keep the frequencies of Earth and cosmos in tune. The concept isn't as mystical as it sounds. Modern satellite networks rely on similar principles, synchronized points across the globe maintaining a shared signal. The difference is that where we use metal and orbiting machinery, the Sumerians used brick and intention. By the time the last ziggurat was completed, the pattern had already expanded beyond Sumer's borders. In Elam, in Persia, and perhaps even further west, echoes of the same stepped architecture appear, each carrying the same proportions, the same material triads, as though the memory of the original grid kept radiating outward. The design survived because it worked, whether as engineering, religion or resonance. It stabilized the cities that built it and the minds that believed in it. Critics will always remind us that practicality explains much of this. Brick, bitumen, and sun-dried ratios endure because they are efficient. But that explanation alone cannot erase the poetry embedded in their precision. These monuments were more than the sum of their materials. They were acts of remembrance, recitations in stone of something once perfectly known. So when the mason at Ur places his final brick and steps back to see the slope align with the morning light, he may not realise that his work connects him to an unbroken chain stretching thousands of years and hundreds of miles. The tower before him is not merely his creation, it is his inheritance. Its proportions hum with mathematics older than his language. Its foundations repeat the same code that once held a world together. Whether by design or devotion, every ziggurat functioned as both a physical and symbolic reboot, a restoration of the ME in 3 dimensions. Each one was a recompiled memory, a calibrated mountain raised to re-establish order after the chaos of the flood. The cities competed in name, but collaborated in architecture, as if each understood it was building part of something larger than itself. The evidence of shared ratios, materials, and orientation points to a simple but profound conclusion. Sumer's towers were not independent inventions. They were synchronized nodes in a much older system, a network whose blueprint survived catastrophe. Identical in form, material and function, the ziggurats behave less like individual temples and more like cloned circuits scattered across a recovering world. And when you map their coordinates across Mesopotamia, the pattern sharpens, widening beyond the desert boundaries. The alignments stretch outward, toward Egypt, toward the Indus Valley, even toward distant lands across the ocean. The match deepens when the map zooms beyond Mesopotamia. At dawn, the air over the ruins of Ur is still and heavy, thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of the river nearby. A modern archaeologist stands beside the crumbling ziggurat with a worn compass in his hand, the needle trembling slightly in the morning heat. He bends, sets the instrument on a flat stone, and watches as the line settles, not north, not random, but precisely where it should not be. The structure before him aligns almost perfectly with true north, deviating by less than half a degree. When he repeats the same test at other Mesopotamian temples, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, the results remain eerily consistent. The ancient Sumerians, it seems, could orient their sacred buildings with an accuracy that would challenge a modern survey team. And what's stranger still, when the archaeologist compares these azimuths to other ancient monuments across the world, the same quiet pattern emerges. Thousands of miles away in the highlands of central Mexico, another set of ruins mirrors the same geometry. Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. Its massive Avenue of the Dead runs along a grid tilted precisely 15.5 degrees east of true north, a peculiar angle that matches alignments found in structures across Mesoamerica, and astonishingly, echoes the same offsets observed in Mesopotamian and Egyptian sites. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, built more than a millennium before Teotihuacan, is aligned to true north with an error smaller than 3 arc minutes, a level of precision that surpasses even some modern observatories. Beneath its limestone casing, veins of granite run through its internal chambers, a pairing of materials identical to those used in Sumer's oldest ziggurats. Soft limestone to absorb vibration, hard granite or quartz to channel and amplify it. The echo of design is undeniable, not identical in form but harmonized in principle. Each of these monuments, Sumerian, Egyptian and Mesoamerican, seems to obey the same invisible grammar: orientation to the cardinal points, selection of conductive materials, proportional ratios tied to celestial cycles. Across continents, the same architectural language recurs, as though the builders of each culture remembered the same fundamental equation, but spoke it in different dialects of stone. The question is how and why. Mainstream archaeology explains this with what it calls convergent ingenuity. All civilizations, it argues, face similar problems: how to track time, how to stabilize heavy structures, how to honor the sky that governs the seasons. Given the shared human mind and the same physical universe, it's inevitable that similar solutions arise independently. To a degree, that's true, but the deeper one digs into the measurements, the less convincing coincidence becomes. The Avenue of the Dead at Teotihuacan is aligned to the setting of the Pleiades and the zenith passage of the sun, events critical for agricultural calendars. Yet the same cluster of stars guided the construction of temples in Sumer, where its heliacal rising marked the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. Both civilizations built their sacred architecture as clocks in stone, tracking the heavens with identical intent. Even their proportions echo one another. The ratio between the pyramid of the sun's base and height in Mexico approximates 4:3, the same geometric relationship encoded in the slope of the Great Pyramid and the terraces of Ur's ziggurat. Then there are the materials. In Mesopotamia, priests collected gypsum, quartz and copper for temple construction. In Egypt, the builders of Giza paired limestone with granite, a combination known for its acoustic and piezoelectric properties. In Teotihuacan, archaeologists have found traces of mica, a mineral that acts as a natural insulator, layered between stones in a way that seems too purposeful to be decorative. Across oceans and millennia, cultures that supposedly never met all chose substances that respond to vibration, light, or heat, materials that hum when stressed, that carry charge, that resonate. In the mid-20th century, a few daring researchers began to wonder if these shared habits pointed to a deeper memory, not coincidence, but continuity. They noticed that many ancient complexes share alignments not just to the stars but to each other. The latitude of Giza, for instance, lies within a fraction of the harmonic ratios used to map Ur's sacred precincts. Lines drawn through the Great Pyramid, Ur's ziggurat, and the ruins of Angkor Wat trace nearly continuous arcs along Earth's curvature, as if each were part of a planetary lattice, the remnants of an older global design. Such ideas are controversial, dismissed by orthodox scholars as pareidolia, humanity's tendency to find patterns where none exist, but the patterns persist. The same base 60 divisions of space and time appear in Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian cubit rods, and Mesoamerican calendars. The same obsession with harmonic numbers, 12, 24, 60, 360, resurfaces again and again. These constants underpin everything from the length of a day to the geometry of the Earth itself. So how did these unconnected civilizations all seem to inherit the same cosmic mathematics? Some historians point to forgotten seafaring cultures, traders or navigators who carried fragments of astronomical knowledge across oceans long before recorded history. Others propose something less tangible, that after the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas, the survivors of a unified prehistoric civilization spread outward, rebuilding in pockets, teaching remnants of their lost sciences to scattered peoples. Whatever the source, the evidence suggests transmission, not invention. Imagine the scene at Teotihuacan's construction site nearly 2,000 years ago. A priest-architect stands before the rising sun, his hands tracing invisible lines in the air as his apprentices pound stakes into the earth. He watches the light touch a distant hilltop, signalling the precise moment to fix the city's axis. It's a ritual of precision, an echo of something far older. The same act repeated by surveyors in Sumer, in Egypt, in China. The same gesture, the same alignment, carried across generations like a memory embedded in muscle. When archaeologists compare notes, the convergences multiply. The platform at Teotihuacan measures roughly 2,300 by 900 feet, dimensions that encode the same 4:3 ratio found in Giza's pyramids and in Sumer's sacred courtyards. The Egyptian builders used the royal cubit, a unit based on Earth's circumference and the 360-degree division of the sky. Mesoamericans used units derived from lunar cycles and solar transit. Yet when scaled, these units produce structures of near identical proportion. Even their ceremonial centres mirror one another, long processional avenues leading to stair-stepped monuments that rise in harmonic sequences, 3, 5, 7 tiers, the same sacred numbers repeated in myth and masonry alike. What's more, geological analysis shows that each site's materials were chosen not just for availability, but for energy interaction. In Giza, the combination of limestone and granite acts as a natural capacitor, storing static charge in the desert's dry air. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats were often plastered with gypsum, a crystalline form of calcium sulfate that fluoresces under ultraviolet light. In Teotihuacan, thin sheets of mica were embedded between stone layers in the Temple of the Sun, a material with remarkable dielectric properties, used in modern times for electrical insulation. None of these choices were random, and none can be explained solely by practicality. When you stand inside one of these ancient structures, the air itself changes. The temperature drops, sounds shift, even whispers seem to stretch and linger, as if the walls are listening. Acoustic engineers who have tested these chambers record standing waves at specific resonant frequencies, tones that amplify naturally, creating an effect both physical and psychological. It's easy to imagine why ancient builders might have considered these resonances sacred, but it also hints at something more deliberate, an understanding of how sound, vibration and structure interact, passed down across continents by builders who no longer remembered where the knowledge began. Still, the academic resistance is fierce. Most scholars dismiss these parallels as overreach, arguing that human architecture always reflects universal constraints: gravity, materials, astronomy, the need for ceremony. But even some cautious researchers admit to a growing unease. The patterns of alignment and proportion are too persistent, too exacting to ignore. The question is not whether people across the world built in harmony with the sky. That's certain. But whether they did so using the same hidden standard. Perhaps it was not a single lost civilization, but a set of instructions, a mental template transmitted through myth. Stories of gods descending from the heavens to teach measurement, navigation, and building reappear in every culture. The Egyptians spoke of Thoth, who measured the heavens and the earth. The Sumerians credited the Me, divine codes of order. The Maya revered Kukulkan, the plumed serpent who taught astronomy and the calendar. Each figure embodies the same role, the bringer of geometry, the restorer of balance after chaos. Their myths may have been the vehicles through which ancient standards survived the flood. As centuries passed, those standards would fracture and drift. The language of alignment became ritual, the mathematics became religion, and the science became myth. What began as calibration ended as ceremony. But fragments persisted, encoded in architecture, embedded in story, etched into stone. The modern archaeologist, his compass still trembling in the heat, sketches the azimuth line in his notebook. As the sun clears the horizon, the shadow of the ziggurat falls perfectly along the mark he drew, confirming the alignment once again. He looks at the faint pencil streak and wonders if he's staring at coincidence or connection. His notes will list it as the former, but a quiet part of him suspects the latter. The feeling is impossible to shake, that the builders of Ur and the builders of Teotihuacan, separated by oceans and centuries, were somehow working from the same invisible instruction. Perhaps the knowledge was never lost entirely, only disguised, carried through migration, whispered in legend, preserved in the muscle memory of builders who still felt the pull of the stars. The geometry may have outlasted the language that once described it. Critics insist these similarities are tricks of perspective. Humans are pattern makers, they remind us. We connect dots that were never meant to be joined. But even they admit the allure of the question. What if the patterns are not imagined? What if these scattered monuments are the surviving nodes of a world once organised by a shared planetary code? For now, the evidence remains ambiguous. Yet the feeling persists, quiet kinship that crosses oceans, linking pyramids and temples, ziggurats and stone avenues into a single breath of design. The same habits of sky and stone repeat where contact seems impossible, like a memory reawakening in different corners of the world. And if these alignments truly belong to an ancient global network, whether of stone, story, or signal, then its silence today may not mean disappearance, it may mean interruption. Because every system that hums eventually falters, every circuit eventually breaks, and when it does, someone, somewhere, will always try to turn it back on. But what happens when a network like this breaks? The geologist crouches on a lonely hilltop, the wind hissing through the grass. Beneath his boots, the soil crunches not like sand or stone, but like shattered glass. He brushes away the dust and lifts a fragment between his fingers. It catches the sunlight, a piece of once solid rock now fused into a glossy black glaze. It rings faintly when he taps it against his hammer, a brittle sound that belongs more in a laboratory than in the open air. Beneath it, the earth is scarred by a thin, burned line. Charred soil compressed and hardened as though seared by a heat. No hearth, forge, or wildfire could ever reach. It's a signature repeated across the ancient world. From the vitrified hill forts of Scotland and France to the melted rock lenses buried beneath the Near Eastern plains, these traces whisper of an event that once burned the world clean. Most archaeologists explain these glassy remnants as the residue of warfare, fortresses torched by invaders, their walls melting in the heat of siege fires. But when geologists test the samples, the data tells a different story. The fusion temperatures recorded in these stones often exceed 1,200 degrees Celsius, sometimes climbing past 2,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to liquefy granite and boil quartz. Ancient kilns, even the most advanced Bronze Age furnaces, barely reached half that threshold. Fires, no matter how intense, cannot vitrify rock so completely. The evidence points towards something far more violent, an episode not of conflict but of catastrophe. To understand what this means, we have to go back to the twilight between two worlds, the end of the last ice age, when glaciers still clawed at the continents and the air itself felt raw with change. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth entered a sudden and mysterious cold spell known as the Younger Dryas. Within decades, global temperatures plummeted, ice sheets re-advanced, and megafauna collapsed. But in that chaos, the world did not simply cool, it burned. Charcoal layers from this period appear on nearly every continent. Sediment cores show massive wildfires, soot clouds, and a global spike in platinum, iridium and microspherules. Tiny glass beads formed in extreme heat. Something struck the Earth with a violence that left no written record, only melted stone and magnetic scars. To many geologists, this marks the ultimate grid failure of early civilization, the planetary reboot that erased whatever had come before. Whether it was a comet impact, a solar outburst, or a cascade of atmospheric detonations, the event was sudden enough to vaporize cities, redirect rivers, and plunge the world into centuries of darkness. The survivors, scattered and stripped of memory, would later recall it as the Great Flood. The day the heavens fell, the night fire rained from the sky. Fragments of that memory still glimmer in the ground. In Turkey, near ancient Göbekli Tepe, researchers have identified melt lenses, thin strata of fused silica and clay embedded within older soils. Laboratory testing revealed they formed at temperatures far beyond any campfire or kiln, consistent instead with the surface heating caused by airbursts or plasma discharges. In northern Syria, a site known as Abu Huraira preserves a similar layer. Microscopic glass spherules and magnetic particles fused by sudden heat, found precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary. The same signature appears in North America, across the Carolina Bays, and in the black matte layers of Clovis-era sites, silt and ash fused into a crust that still glints under the desert sun. The pattern is global. Across Europe, dozens of Iron Age fortresses sit atop vitrified stone ramparts, walls melted into glassy slag, as if torched from within. Early archaeologists assumed these were intentional, perhaps attempts to strengthen fortifications through heat fusing. But experiments to replicate this failed. Even modern blast furnaces struggle to reproduce the smooth, uniform glazing seen in the ruins. The fire must have been hotter, faster, and sustained across large areas, conditions impossible to achieve by human hands of that age. At certain sites in France, like Château de Perrin and Le Douai, stones are fused not only at their surfaces but deep within, suggesting a temperature gradient that moved through the rock like a wave, rather than licking it from above. In Scotland's vitrified forts, magnetic anomalies linger, as if the event that melted the walls also altered their magnetic orientation. Compass needles twitch near the fused stone. Handheld magnetometers show erratic spikes. The rock itself carries a record of the planet's trauma, frozen in polarity. Back in the laboratory, the geologist lays the black shard from the hilltop beneath a microscope. Under magnification, the smooth glass reveals bubbles, tiny spheres of trapped gas, remnants of violent expansion. A spectral analysis shows elevated iron and nickel, metals often associated with meteoritic dust. His notebook fills with numbers, temperatures and annotations that strain the limits of plausibility. Too hot for combustion, he writes. Possible plasma interaction. It's the kind of data that makes careers, or ruins them. Mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical. They argue that vitrification can result from accidental fires, from stored timber and pitch igniting catastrophically, or from volcanic activity in nearby regions. They point out that not all vitrified sites date to the same period, and that some show signs of human rebuilding afterward. To them, this is evidence of repeated local disasters, not a global cataclysm. But the dissenting voices, though fewer, are growing louder. Researchers studying paleomagnetic shifts at multiple ancient sites have noted a strange synchronicity. Around 12,800 BCE, the Earth's magnetic field appears to have spasmed. In ice cores, this same interval shows spikes in beryllium-10, a cosmogenic isotope that surges during solar outbursts. If a massive solar storm, an order of magnitude beyond the Carrington event of 1859, struck the planet when its atmosphere was still dense with dust, the resulting electromagnetic pulse could have ignited widespread fires, melted surface layers, and distorted magnetic north across hemispheres. In other words, the grid didn't fail because civilization collapsed. Civilization collapsed because the grid of the planet itself, the magnetic lattice that sustains weather and electricity, went offline. Consider what such an event would look like to those who lived through it. The sky splitting open with fire, oceans boiling at their edges, rivers turning black with ash, the night glowing like a second dawn. No wonder nearly every ancient tradition speaks of the world ending in both fire and flood. The waters that followed may have been not a punishment, but a reaction. Meltwater floods from destabilized ice sheets sweeping across continents, erasing cities, rewriting coastlines, and burying evidence beneath hundreds of feet of silt. Even thousands of years later, the land still remembers. Satellite imaging over parts of the Middle East shows vast, faint discolorations, long streaks of magnetically altered soil that align with no known river or fault line. Beneath some of these, ground-penetrating radar reveals layers of fused sediment, as if an ancient lightning bolt had struck and kept burning underground. In the Indus Valley, magnetic surveys have identified similar anomalies beneath long-abandoned mounds, their orientations mirroring the cardinal alignments of early temples. Coincidence, perhaps, but perhaps not. To the few who study this puzzle through both geology and myth, these scars are not random. They are the fingerprints of a system overload, the grid failure of an earlier age when the Earth itself convulsed. The same world that once hummed with harmony between stone, sky and signal was suddenly drowned in static. If the ziggurats and pyramids once acted as stabilizers or harmonizers within that global network, their loss would have amplified the chaos. What had been a symphony became noise. One compelling theory suggests that when these monuments fell silent, whether through natural disaster or celestial impact, the balance between Earth's natural frequencies and human structures broke. The planet's electromagnetic envelope fluctuated wildly, creating bursts of ground current strong enough to melt stone at points of high conductivity. Mountaintops, hill forts, and temples, places already rich in quartz and metal. In this model, vitrification becomes not an act of war but a record of resonance failure. Still, the evidence remains contested. Every time a new vitrified site is found, debate follows. Could ancient builders have inadvertently caused the melting through ritual fires or defensive blazes? Or were these ruins the collateral damage of a global power surge, one that seared its way into legend? For now, the science sits in a liminal space, caught between archaeology and anomaly. But there's something undeniable about the imagery. Across continents, we find the same blackened layers, the same glassy crusts, the same shards that ring like bells when struck. In the quiet of excavation pits, these fragments glitter like frozen lightning. They whisper that once, long ago, energy poured through this planet in ways we can hardly imagine. To some, the vitrified ruins are evidence of an ancient war, perhaps even the echoes of a lost civilization's self-destruction, the mythical fire from heaven that ended an age. To others, they are geological coincidences. But to a growing number of researchers, they represent something far subtler. The residue of an event that changed the world's circuitry, a planetary short circuit. Even modern technology struggles to reproduce such effects without leaving traceable residues of combustion or slag. Yet these ancient samples contain none. No charcoal, no ash, just rock transformed to glass, as if the atoms themselves were rearranged in an instant. Some theorists point to high-energy plasma phenomena or cosmic ray bursts as the only mechanisms capable of such change without visible burn patterns. Whatever the cause, the stones are silent witnesses to a moment when the normal rules failed. And perhaps that is the true story buried in these vitrified hills, the story of a civilization undone not by time or conquest, but by physics itself, a network that grew too charged, too resonant, until the very ground overheated. The Earth's crust became its own warning system, flashing bright for an instant, then cooling into darkness. In the silence that followed, the survivors would have seen their world reduced to ash and glass. They would have gathered the few remaining fragments of knowledge, rebuilt where the ground was still cool, and rewritten their myths to explain what had happened. The stories of gods casting thunderbolts, of floods sent to cleanse the earth, of fire raining from the heavens. Perhaps all of them are memories of that single moment when the grid went dark. And yet, the ground still hums faintly beneath those ruins. The vitrified stones, when struck, ring with a tone that seems to echo beyond hearing, like a residual frequency, a ghost of the event that shaped them. The geologist kneeling on that hilltop closes his notebook and listens. For a moment he imagines he can hear the world's old pulse, buried but not gone. Because glass once formed keeps its memory. It carries the story of heat, of pressure, of transformation. It remembers the instant it was liquid, the chaos before it cooled. The earth too remembers. Beneath the rivers and deserts, in thin layers of fused sand and magnetic swirl, lies the record of an age when light and fire ruled the skies, and the grid of civilization, whatever form it once took, flickered and failed. The ground carries that memory still, even when the stories blur, and if the lights once failed, the next move, as always, would have been to save what could still be saved. The air inside the temple workshop is warm and thick with the scent of wet clay. A high priest leans over a tablet, his reed stylus cutting steady wedges into its surface, while, outside, the muffled rhythm of construction carries through the walls. Bricks rise layer by layer, glistening with bitumen as the ziggurat takes shape in the sun. Inside, the priest's tablet records weights, rations, celestial observations and sacred rituals, all in the same careful hand. The builders and the scribes may not speak to each other, yet their tasks are bound together. One raises walls from the earth, the other raises order from symbols. Both believe they are building something permanent. In Sumer, the temple was more than a house of gods. It was a memory engine. Each city's temple complex functioned like the brain of a living organism, collecting, organizing, and safeguarding the data that made civilization possible. Geometry, calendars, measurements, laws, all were inscribed and stored in these sacred centers. The ziggurat rising above was not merely a monument to divinity, it was a beacon of stability, a literal high point where knowledge could be preserved when the rivers rose again. At Nippur, the spiritual and intellectual capital of Sumer, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets stacked in systematic rows. They record everything from celestial charts to legal transactions, from hymns to building specifications. Many are duplicates, backup copies so to speak, preserved in multiple rooms. At Ur, in the great temple of the moon, god Nana, similar archive chambers have been found, filled with ledgers that list grain inventories, wages, and construction records. These rooms were not designed as mere offices, they were engineered environments, clay floors to regulate humidity, walls coated with gypsum to prevent rot. Doorways aligned to the prevailing breeze to keep the air dry. The architecture itself served the function of preservation. The more one studies these sites, the clearer it becomes that Sumerian temples were not built only for worship. They were built for storage, not of grain, but of information. Each tablet was a bite of civilization, stamped in wet clay, baked in fire and filed on shelves that line the walls of the sacred precincts. When later generations excavated these ruins, they found what could only be described as the first data centers in human history, temples acting as servers, their contents organized by subject, language, and purpose. The design of these temple complexes reveals intent beyond administration. Their layouts follow consistent geometry, rectangular courtyards proportioned by 3:2 ratios, corridors aligned to the cardinal directions, chambers grouped by function. Some scholars interpret this as mere tradition or aesthetic choice, but others, like the Assyriologist Samuel Kramer, noted that the precision of temple design mirrored the precision of the information contained within. The building was the message, a physical manifestation of Sumer's commitment to order, balance, and reproducibility. Inside the temple schools, young scribes trained for years to master the cuneiform system. Their lessons began not with myth, but with math, tables of multiplication, reciprocals, and constants. The base 60 system we still use to measure time and angles originates here. 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary. They are echoes of the Sumerian grid, the framework through which they saw both heaven and earth. Every measurement, every proportion in their cities followed this numeric logic. The temple was where that logic was learned, practiced, and encoded into architecture. Picture a trainee scribe hunched over his tablet by lamplight, copying a sequence of metrology signs, lengths, weights, and capacities standardized to 6s and 12s. Each wedge pressed into clay feels like a heartbeat, a unit of stability in a world that still trembled from memory of the flood. His instructor reminds him that precision isn't just a virtue, it's survival. One incorrect wedge could misalign the temple's calendar, disrupt trade, or miscalculate a foundation's slope. In a civilization rebuilding from chaos, accuracy was sacred. To be precise was to be faithful. The connection between writing, architecture, and divinity wasn't symbolic, it was functional. The Sumerians saw their gods not as abstractions, but as principles of order that governed natural forces. To record their decrees accurately was to keep the universe synchronized. That's why the ME, those divine ordinances or cosmic codes, were stored within temples alongside administrative records. The prescribes did not separate religion from science, nor faith from engineering. To them, the act of recording was itself a ritual of repair, the process of maintaining the harmony between heaven and earth. This dual purpose, the fusion of sacred and practical, transformed every major temple into what might best be called a repository of civilization. The temples of Uruk, and Nippur each served as localized hubs, but they followed identical standards, the same system of weights and measures, the same forms of writing, even the same training curricula. The repetition is striking. Each temple produced the same types of documents in nearly the same order, as if all were following a shared operating protocol. That level of uniformity suggests deliberate coordination. These weren't isolated city-states improvising their way into bureaucracy. They were nodes in a collective system, what we might call a distributed network of knowledge. Every temple maintained its own copy of essential information: tax records, building codes, star catalogues, rituals, and legal precedents. If one city fell to flood or conquest, another could restore it using the same templates. Civilization could reboot itself. Critics, of course, see a simpler picture. They argue that temples were just efficient centres of control, places where priests managed labour, land, and worship in the service of growing city-states. The archives, they say, reflect nothing mystical, only the logistics of early urban life. But this misses something essential. The Sumerians themselves tell us, in their hymns and inscriptions, that knowledge was the true sacred substance housed within these walls. The gods, they believed, had entrusted humanity with the embossé, the patterns that kept the world in tune, and those patterns had to be copied, preserved, and reactivated after every great upheaval. Even the physical act of inscription seems designed with redundancy in mind. Clay was chosen because it endured fire, flood, and time better than parchment or wood. When cities burned, their archives didn't vanish, they hardened. What was meant to preserve divine law ended up preserving history itself. Across millennia, those tablets still whisper the same data their creators recorded. Ledgers, calendars, star charts, and prayers, each inscribed wedge a pulse of a once-living system. In this light, the ziggurat that loomed above each temple complex becomes something more than a monument. It was the visible emblem of invisible order, the hard drive to the temple's data core. Its massive bulk, layered in ascending terraces, reflected the tiered hierarchies of the cosmos and the bureaucracies below. The topmost shrine, often dedicated to a celestial deity, mirrored the heavens, while the base connected to the underworld through deep foundation stones. The structure wasn't symbolic metaphor. It was a model of the universe, rendered in brick, calibrated to scale. When the priest stood at its summit and observed the sky, he wasn't performing mere ritual, he was taking readings. The temple's upper terrace functioned as an observation deck, a place where priests tracked Venus, the moon, and the equinoxes to maintain the calendar that governed harvests, festivals, and floods. Many of these records survive, like the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, which contain observations so precise they can be correlated to modern astronomical data. The temple's geometry, its height, its sight lines, its angles, was built to facilitate these calculations. It's no wonder the Sumerians referred to their temples as bond houses, connecting heaven and earth. Their architecture embodied both communication and calibration. The higher one climbed the ziggurat, the closer one came to the interface between human knowledge and cosmic order. To walk up its stairs was to move from matter to mathematics, from the physical to the eternal. Some modern researchers have drawn comparisons between these temples and information systems, arguing that they operated as redundant backups of civilizational memory. The consistency of measurement standards across Sumer's cities, right down to identical cubit rods and weight stones, suggests a deliberate protocol of replication. If one city was lost to flood, the others could reconstruct its records from copies. It's a pattern eerily similar to how digital data is preserved today: mirrored drives, distributed servers, each storing the same essential files to prevent total loss. The more we examine the evidence, the more this metaphor begins to feel literal. Even the language of preservation mirrors technological logic. Inscriptions refer to the tablets of destiny, which record the fates of gods and men alike stored in divine repositories. The idea that the universe itself runs on written decrees, that reality depends on encoded information, is a startlingly modern concept. In a way, the Sumerians anticipated the digital worldview. That order emerges from code, that chaos is a result of corrupted data, and that survival depends on accurate duplication. Imagine, then, the scene after catastrophe. Floodwaters receding, smoke rising from the plains, survivors gathering in the ruins of what was once a city. Amid the mud and silence, a priest retrieves a single tablet from the debris, still legible, still intact. It contains a list of weights, proportions, or rites. From that small fragment, reconstruction begins. Brick by brick, wedge by wedge, the order of the world is rewritten. Civilization does not start from scratch, it reloads from backup. This vision aligns with how Sumer appears in the archaeological record. There's no gradual build-up, no visible evolution from primitive to advanced. It simply emerges, fully structured, fully literate, already standardized. The temples and ziggurats seem to have carried the blueprints of something older, preserving it through disaster. The system that failed during the Younger Dryas found its recovery in Sumer, where the survivors rebuilt not just walls, but the framework of knowledge itself. That may explain the intensity of Sumer's obsession with record-keeping, precision and duplication. They weren't inventing civilization, they were restoring it. Every scribe who pressed a stylus into clay was contributing to that restoration, ensuring that what had once been lost would not vanish again. Their libraries were not archives of the past, they were insurance for the future. When we look at the ruins of and Nippur today, their walls half buried and silent, it's easy to forget that these places once thrummed with information. Each shelf of tablets was a databank, each brick a record of geometry, each priest an operator maintaining the system. In that sense, the ziggurat was not only a temple, but a machine of memory, designed to outlast both disaster and time. Critics continue to frame these interpretations as poetic exaggeration. Yet, the Sumerians themselves might have seen no distinction between poetry and physics. To them, the sacred was the practical. The act of writing, of building, of measuring, all were ways of maintaining the flow of divine order. And so, when the high priest pressed his stylus into clay while the builders hauled bricks outside, they were performing the same function on different scales. One encoded knowledge in text, the other encoded it in stone. Together they were reconstructing the interface between humanity and the cosmos, the ancient grid that once linked every living thing in harmony. Whether by design or instinct, Sumer became the reboot hub of a fallen world. Its temples and ziggurats behaved like backup drives, restoring data lost in the great system crash of prehistory. Within their walls, humanity relearned the art of synchronization, the alignment of thought, structure, and sky. The city's core did not simply manage worship or governance. It behaved like an archive with walls, a safeguard against forgetting. And if clay and stone were the mediums of storage, then perhaps the ziggurat itself, the great ascending mountain of brick and code, was also tuned to something deeper. Because once the knowledge was secured, the next question became inevitable. If stone and clay could hold memory, what might the structure itself have been built to hold? In a dim laboratory filled with the soft hum of machines, a granite block sits beneath a set of sensors. The researcher leans forward and turns a dial, sweeping through frequencies in slow, deliberate increments. At first, the rock is still. Then, at a certain pitch, barely audible to human ears, it begins to vibrate. A faint shiver runs through the stone, the oscilloscope's green line pulsing into perfect rhythm. The granite, inert and ancient, suddenly behaves like something alive. It resonates. The signal is clean, sharp, and unmistakable. The stone is responding to sound. It seems like a small thing, rocks reacting to vibration. But in this sterile lab, a quiet question begins to take form. What happens when we take that same frequency and scale it up to the size of a temple, or a pyramid, or an entire city? Granite, limestone, and quartz are not just building materials, they are mineral conductors. Modern physics knows that certain crystals, especially quartz, exhibit the piezoelectric effect, the ability to convert mechanical pressure into electrical charge and vice versa. Squeeze a crystal and it generates voltage. Apply voltage and it vibrates. In the small confines of a lab, this principle powers lighters, sonar systems, and precision clocks. But in the ancient world, these same materials were the foundation of sacred architecture. If temples and pyramids were constructed with quartz-bearing stone and proportioned to resonate with specific frequencies, could they have acted as natural amplifiers, machines tuned to the earth itself? This idea, dismissed for decades as fringe speculation, has begun to attract cautious attention as more physical data accumulates. Acoustic engineers testing chambers within the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, have recorded infrasound frequencies that align with the natural resonances of the Earth's crust. When tones between 5 and 20 Hz are introduced, the air within the King's Chamber oscillates at harmonic intervals, creating standing waves strong enough to cause the walls to subtly flex. The chamber's granite blocks, each weighing between 25 and 80 tons, contain high quartz content. Under vibration, they produce measurable electrical potentials. The structure behaves less like a tomb and more like a tuned cavity, one capable of interacting with energy on a planetary scale. Similar phenomena appear in other ancient sites. At Newgrange in Ireland, an enormous passage tomb older than Stonehenge, researchers found that a sustained low tone near 110 Hz causes the inner chamber to vibrate sympathetically, amplifying the sound to near choir-like intensity. The same tone, when hummed by human voices, triggers physical sensations, pressure in the chest, tingling in the skin, suggesting the builders knew exactly how to exploit resonance for sensory or spiritual effect. At megalithic sites like Malta's Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, these effects are even more pronounced. Deep vocal sounds produce standing waves that modulate brainwave activity in those present, a measurable neurological shift documented by acoustic scientists in 2014. Could it be that ancient architects without formal instruments learned to read the feedback of stone and sound the way musicians tune an instrument, iteratively by feel? Some researchers think so. The temples of Sumer, with their layered bricks and embedded quartz-bearing stones, seem to exhibit the same qualities of harmonic design. Their ratios, base width to height, step to terrace, correspond to resonant frequencies when scaled to the audible and infrasound spectrum. It's as though the ziggurats were built not just to be seen, but to sing. The human connection to these structures reinforces the idea. Ancient hymns, inscribed on tablets from Ur and Nippur, describe rituals performed with sound, priests chanting in unison while drums and horns echoed off the temple walls. The purpose, according to the texts, was to awaken the stones and call down the light. At face value, that's poetry. But viewed through the lens of resonance, it reads like instruction. The act of chanting at a specific frequency could have induced the very vibrations that modern equipment now detects, causing the structures to hum faintly, their stones momentarily alive with motion. It's no coincidence that the same materials recur across these sites. Sumerians favoured limestone and fired brick layered with bitumen, a natural hydrocarbon with conductive and insulating properties. The Egyptians lined their inner chambers with granite and capped their pyramids with polished limestone casing that reflected light, and possibly directed static charge. In South America, the builders of Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman used granite blocks that fit so precisely they resist even modern cutting tools. Across the world, the ancient builders were not just stacking rocks, they were composing in mineral notes, combining materials that respond to pressure, vibration, and magnetism in complex ways. Modern experiments have begun to verify what ancient legends have long suggested. These stones were not inert. At the University of Seville, engineers measuring piezoelectric discharge in granite samples found that even the weight of a single human footstep could generate detectable voltage differences when the crystals were properly aligned. Multiply that across the scale of a 5,000-ton pyramid, and you begin to imagine what might happen if the structure as a whole began to resonate. In some cases, evidence hints that the ancients were aware of this behaviour. Magnetic surveys of Egyptian temples show that many are aligned to subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field, not just to the cardinal directions or stars. Their foundations often sit on zones of high geomagnetic gradient, places where the natural flow of energy through the crust is strongest. A 2018 study by the Czech Geophysical Society mapped these anomalies and found consistent patterns between ancient sacred sites and geomagnetic hotspots. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamia, where ziggurats often crown ridges rich in iron and quartz, materials that amplify electromagnetic response. What were these alignments for? Some archaeologists argue they were symbolic, tying heaven and earth together through celestial geometry, but others see a more technical purpose. The sites may have acted as resonant amplifiers, converting the planet's low-frequency hum, the Schumann resonance, into localized vibrations that could affect matter, mood, or even biological processes. In modern terms, they were tuned circuits embedded in the landscape. Critics insist that this is wishful thinking, a retroactive application of modern physics to a pre-scientific age. They argue that even if these effects exist, they are coincidences, the byproducts of architectural genius, not its purpose. The ancients, they say, built intuitively. They could not have known about electromagnetic fields or acoustic harmonics. Yet, this argument assumes ignorance rather than observation. A culture that built by hand, stone by stone, for generations would have noticed what we've forgotten. How sound changes in different spaces, how certain materials make hair stand on end, how compasses drift near specific walls. To the builders, these phenomena would not have been scientific, they would have been sacred. The truth likely lies between skepticism and myth. The evidence suggests not that ancient architects understood why resonance occurred, but that they learned how to use it. Through centuries of experimentation, Rebuilding, tuning, refining, they discovered principles that mirror our modern physics. Each layer of stone adjusted the tone, each chamber calibrated the echo. Over time, they learned that certain shapes, triangular faces, domed ceilings, long corridors, multiplied the power of sound. The results were so consistent that the pattern spread across continents. In the Great Pyramid, scientists have measured standing acoustic waves between 30 and 300 Hz, the same range that triggers resonance in quartz-rich stone. At the Hypodrome of Malta, a single baritone voice can generate the same. In the megalithic chambers of Karnak, France, sound maps reveal harmonic fields that match the layout of the stones themselves, as if the entire structure was designed as a resonator. The alignment of stone, sound and magnetism seems almost deliberate, an architecture of energy rather than aesthetics. And what happens when these forces interact? When sound moves through quartz-bearing stone, it produces faint electric charges. When magnetism intersects with crystalline lattices, it can generate measurable current. These effects, though tiny, become significant at scale. The entire structure becomes a kind of transducer, converting environmental energy into vibration, vibration into sound, sound into charge. Modern laboratories call this piezoelectric coupling. The ancients may have called it divinity. Picture again the researcher in the lab. He adjusts his sensor, increasing the signal slightly. The granite block begins to hum audibly now, the tone low and almost mournful. He places his hand on the surface and feels the vibration running through his bones. It's faint, but it's there. A tremor of invisible dialogue between matter and motion. Now imagine that same principle scaled up. The humming of temples, the whisper of pyramids under the desert sun, the faint electrical fields flickering through walls that no longer stand. If we strip away the vocabulary of science and speak instead in myth, this is what the ancients meant by living stone. To them, the temple was not dead architecture. It was a participant in the world's rhythm. The god did not simply dwell there. The god was the vibration itself, the resonance between the structure, the earth, and the sky. Every chant, every drumbeat, every ritual fire added energy to that system, keeping the cosmic order alive. And perhaps this is why so many ancient monuments share the same underlying geometry, not merely because of shared math, but shared physics. The Pythagorean ratios of 3 to 4 to 5 that define the Great Pyramid's slope, the 1 to square root of 2 ratio of Sumerian ziggurats, the harmonic triads of Mayan temples, all correspond to resonant intervals in sound. In musical terms, these structures are chords, physical harmonies built into the landscape. When the system failed, when the grid of global resonance collapsed at the end of the last ice age, the world fell silent. The survivors who rebuilt in Sumer may not have remembered the cause, but they remembered the feeling, the hum of the earth, the balance between vibration and form. They rebuilt their temples and ziggurats not just as houses for gods, but as tuning forks for the planet. The rituals that took place there, song, chant, drum, were not mere devotion. They were attempts to restart the system, to bring the world back into frequency. The skeptics still raise fair objections. Laboratory results do not prove ancient intent. A measured resonance does not mean it was designed. But even the critics admit that the data is real. The chambers resonate, the stones react, the materials align. And that raises an unavoidable question. If these effects are coincidences, why do they happen only in sacred architecture? Why not in ordinary structures, in common homes or storehouses? Why only in the places meant to connect humanity to the divine? The answer may be that the ancients didn't need to understand electromagnetism or acoustics in our sense. They only needed to feel the response, the goosebumps, the hair standing on end, the shared vibration of 100 voices echoing through a stone chamber that seemed to answer back. That was their proof. They built more of what worked. Over time, the repetition became tradition, the tradition became doctrine, and the doctrine became myth. Today, in laboratories like the one where that granite block hums under artificial tone, we are rediscovering what the ancients already knew, that matter itself can remember vibration, that sound can shape structure, that energy and geometry are bound by laws we still barely comprehend. The researchers write down numbers. The Sumerians wrote down hymns. Both are describing the same phenomenon in different languages, and perhaps, if we listen closely enough, the world itself still speaks that forgotten tongue, the low frequency of the planet, the heartbeat of stone. Because when the geologists and engineers close their instruments and the lab falls silent, there's always a lingering hum, faint and impossible to place. Some say it's the sound of machines cooling, the resonance of air ducts, the buzz of power lines. But to those who've stood inside the Great Pyramid, or beneath the vaulted chamber of Ur's ziggurat, it's unmistakable. It's the same frequency that moves through everything, the same tone that once made the stones shiver. And it may be all that remains of a world that didn't just build with stone, but built through it. A civilization that understood, instinctively, that knowledge, power, and sound were once the same thing. Before Sumer's scribes began to record their lessons on clay, others, perhaps far older, had already stored the same knowledge in vibration and geometry. They left their instructions not in words, but in resonance. And so, when we measure the hum of granite today, we may not be discovering something new at all. We may just be replaying the last echo of what the Earth itself once remembered. The morning sun rises over the southern marshes of Uruk, and the air already smells of salt and wet clay. A field assistant kneels at the edge of an ancient canal cut into the soil, her boots sinking into the dark silt. She places a small wooden level against the wall of the trench and watches the bubble centre itself perfectly. The slope is precise, just steep enough for water to flow, but gentle enough to prevent erosion. This canal, long since filled and buried, is nearly 7,000 years old, yet the geometry of its cut shows something unmistakable. Whoever built it understood engineering. Long before the world's first cities, before the ziggurats and temples of Sumer, a quiet and methodical civilization was already shaping the land with intention and control. This was the Ubad culture, the shadow civilization that came before Sumer. It flourished between 6,500 and 3,800 BCE, occupying the same alluvial plains that would later cradle Ur, Eridu and Uruk. And while its name rarely appears in history books, its fingerprints are everywhere, in the irrigation ditches, the uniform houses, the standardized pottery, and the faint traces of social order that predate written law. To most archaeologists, the Ubayyad are the prelude to Sumer, the prologue to civilization's rise. But to others, they are something stranger. The librarians of a vanished world, the quiet custodians who carried fragments of a lost knowledge through a dark age of mud and flood. The Ubaid period began in the soft delta between the Tigris and Euphrates, a place that might once have been coastline. Back then, the Persian Gulf extended farther inland, and much of what is now desert was marshland and estuary. The people who lived there built low, rectangular houses of mud brick arranged in planned clusters, often oriented along cardinal directions. They dug canals with consistent gradients, suggesting not random adaptation but systematic hydraulic engineering. These early settlements were small, clusters of a few hundred people, but they shared common standards, from construction methods to pottery styles, across hundreds of miles. At the site of Eridu, often called the world's first city, the deepest archaeological layers belong to the Ubaid. Long before Eridu became a temple city of Enki, it was a humble village of reed huts and clay walls. Yet even then, it showed hierarchy. A central building larger than the rest, built on a raised platform surrounded by organised dwellings and storage pits. This early form would later evolve into the ziggurat, the sacred mountain in brick. But in its Ubaid stage, it was already a symbol of coordination, of a community that worked as one mind. As archaeologists excavated these layers, they noticed something uncanny. The further down they dug, the more consistent the measurements became. House sizes, wall thicknesses, and pottery shapes all followed repeating ratios as if guided by a shared template. Across vast distances, from northern Mesopotamia to the southern Gulf, the same ceramics appear. Smooth, painted bowls with geometric patterns of green and black. No trade networks of such reach should have existed in that age, yet the styles are uniform as though a single cultural code had spread across the land. To skeptics, this uniformity is simply a sign of regional influence, the natural spread of techniques among neighbouring villages. But to those who look deeper, it hints at something else, a collective effort to preserve standards. The Ubaid, they argue, were not just early farmers and potters. They were curators of memory, rebuilding the scaffolding of civilization piece by piece after a great collapse. This idea gains traction when one studies the Ubaid's infrastructure. Their canals were not crude ditches. They were engineered waterways with consistent cross-sections and controlled gradients, feeding fields that stretched in grids. Sediment analysis shows evidence of long-term maintenance, repeated dredging, reinforcement, and even widening over generations. In other words, the Ubaid didn't stumble into irrigation. They managed it with foresight. They understood hydraulics, seasonal flow, and soil behaviour, skills that appear fully mature by the time Sumer emerges. So where did they learn this? How does a small, pre-urban culture muster the principles of water management that would take other civilizations millennia to rediscover? It's a question that has haunted archaeologists since the first Ubaid sites were unearthed in the 1920s. Some suggest the answer lies in continuity, that the Ubaid inherited their techniques from even earlier, now lost cultures along the ancient coastline of the Gulf, drowned when sea levels rose after the last ice age. Underwater surveys have identified submerged mounds and channel systems along what would have been fertile plains between 7000 and 5000 BCE. If those sites were indeed settlements, they could represent the missing link between the post-flood survivors of the Younger Dryas and the organised agrarians of the Ubaid. In this light, the Ubaid might not be a beginning, but a continuation, the first visible survivors of the civilization that refused to vanish entirely. The material evidence deepens the mystery. Among the Ubaid artefacts are figurines unlike anything found elsewhere, elongated heads, slitted eyes, and lizard-like faces. Many hold infants with the same features. Others wear headdresses or sit in poses of authority. Some researchers dismiss these as stylized fertility idols. Others, however, see them as totems of memory, perhaps even depictions of revered ancestors or teachers from before the flood. Their strange, non-human proportions could symbolize those who came before, beings who brought knowledge that humans could not yet fully understand. The Ubaid also practiced cranial deformation, deliberately shaping the skulls of infants to elongate them, a custom found in distant cultures from Peru to Egypt. Whether aesthetic or symbolic, it reflects a fascination with form, symmetry, and the manipulation of nature itself. Some interpret it as an imitation of revered figures, others as a ritual connection to an older lineage. Whatever the reason, it marks the Ubaid as participants in a shared global tradition, a remnant echo of something larger that once spanned continents. The more one studies their world, the more organised it appears. Settlement hierarchies emerge, small villages feeding regional centres like Eridu and Tel al-Ubaid, each linked by waterways and trade routes. There is evidence of centralised storage and distribution, implying leadership and coordination. Agricultural records carved millennia later still reference irrigation systems first dug in Ubaid times. Even their pottery, painted with balanced geometric bands, seems to carry encoded ratios, perhaps an aesthetic echo of the same mathematical mind that later produced Sumerian-based 60 calculations. A dig supervisor at a Ubaid site once described the experience as watching civilization practice for its debut. Everything is there, the planning, the precision, the social layers, but restrained, as if waiting for a signal to accelerate. Then, around 3800 BCE, something shifts. The Ubaid disappear and the Sumerians appear. The change is abrupt, almost theatrical. The settlements that once bore the Ubaid signature transform into early cities overnight. Writing, monumental architecture and administration erupt fully formed. It's as if the Ubaid had been laying the foundation, preparing the ground for a system ready to be switched back on. Critics insist this is simply evolution, the Ubaid slowly evolving into Uruk culture, their descendants developing writing and statehood naturally. But the archaeological record doesn't fully support that neat progression. There's a gap, a discontinuity in layers, a missing bridge between the late Ubaid and early Uruk levels. It's as though a generation vanished and another appeared, fluent in technologies and organisational systems that should have taken centuries to mature. Supporters of the librarian theory suggest that the Ubaid represent a bottleneck of survival. They were not a lost branch, but a holding pattern, preserving critical skills in small, stable communities until the world was ready to rebuild at scale. Their mastery of irrigation, pottery standardization, and construction wasn't innovation, but retention. They kept the flame alive through centuries of relative quiet, waiting until climate, population, and opportunity aligned. When that happened, when the rivers stabilized and floodwaters receded, the knowledge flowed northward like the rivers themselves, seeding the miracle of Sumer. To imagine this transition, picture the field assistant in that ancient canal trench. She lifts the painted shard she's found, a fragment of Ubaid pottery decorated with dark green spirals. Its glaze still glints faintly after 6,000 years. She turns it over in her hand, feeling its weight, the faint ridges where the potter's fingers once turned the wheel. The design is simple, geometric, symmetrical. To her, it's art. To the Ubaid, it may have been code, a pattern of ratios, a miniature reflection of the world's balance. She looks up across the flat landscape, now barren, and imagines what once stood here. A settlement of order and intent. Canals glittering in the sun, quiet people working the fields, keeping something precious alive. This is the human core of the Ubaid mystery, their quietness. They left no kings, no conquests, no dramatic monuments. They did not carve their names into stone. Their greatness lies in continuity, not dominance. Yet without them, Sumer might never have risen. Their irrigation grids became the arteries of the first cities. Their planning logic became the blueprint for temple compounds. Their sense of proportion, their preference for symmetry and balance became the architectural DNA of Mesopotamia. To view them as simple farmers is to miss the deeper story. Their consistency, their restraint, their almost obsessive adherence to standard forms all suggest intent, not accident. They were, in a sense, archivists of the earth. While the rest of the world struggled to recover from the climatic chaos of the post-flood centuries, the Ubaid quietly rebuilt systems of knowledge, how to manage water, shape clay, balance space, and perhaps even how to align with the greater rhythms of the planet. When Sumer finally emerged, it did so as if inheriting a manual already written. Its gods, its symbols, its myths, they all have faint Ubaid roots. Enki, the god of water and wisdom, whose temple at Eridu became Sumer's first sacred centre, is thought to descend directly from Ubaid beliefs. The notion of water as the source of life, of wisdom arising from the depths, may have been the cultural memory of the Ubaid's marshland engineers, their canals, their mastery of tides, their reverence for balance. Archaeologists call this cultural continuity, but one might also call it a handoff. The Ubaid dug, built, and recorded silently, ensuring that the next chapter of civilization could begin not from ignorance, but from remembrance. The transfer may not have been literal, no one passing scrolls or tablets, but structural, encoded in design, proportion, and practice. In their canals, their ceramics, and their settlements, the Ubaid left behind the framework of order, waiting to be rediscovered by those who came after. And so, when we kneel beside their canals today, we are tracing not the beginning of civilization, but its recovery. The Ubaid were not the dawn. They were the keepers of twilight, the ones who carried the last light of a forgotten world across the long night. The soil still bears the imprint of their precision. The canals still follow the same slopes. And in the mud, where a painted shard stares back with a single patient eye, the message remains. We remembered enough to begin again. A handoff is visible in the ground, even if the hands themselves are gone. And just beyond their horizon, another thread was already forming, older still, buried not by water but by deliberate intent. A site where the memory of the pre-flood world wasn't merely forgotten, but hidden. The sun rises slowly over the dusty hills of southeastern Turkey, washing the limestone ridges in pale gold. A team of archaeologists stands silently at the lip of a deep trench. Below them, pillars of carved stone emerge from the earth like frozen giants, their surfaces etched with animals, foxes, vultures, serpents, boars, so sharply defined they seem to breathe in the morning light. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill, though its name barely hints at its significance. It is older than Stonehenge by 6 millennia, older than the first cities by thousands of years. According to radiocarbon dating, it was built between 9,600 and 8,000 BCE, before the invention of writing, pottery or agriculture, and yet its stones weigh as much as 20 tons each. Its carvings show anatomical mastery, and its design reflects geometry no hunter-gatherer society should have known. The mystery is not just how it was built, but why it was buried, deliberately, carefully, as if sealed for safekeeping. The first archaeologist to uncover Göbekli Tepe's secret, Klaus Schmidt, described his discovery as a message to the future. When he first brushed away the dirt from one of the great T-shaped pillars, he realized he was staring at the world's earliest known monument, a structure that predated settled civilization but was already monumental in concept and scale. The site's concentric enclosures, each ringed by massive pillars facing inward, formed open-air sanctuaries aligned not randomly, but according to celestial markers. The builders had no metal tools, no beasts of burden, yet they carved these stones with an artistry and mathematical precision, rivaling later empires. Something about this place feels anachronistic, as if it belongs to a civilization that shouldn't have existed yet, a civilization that knew too much. Each enclosure at Göbekli Tepe contains 2 central pillars flanked by smaller ones, all arranged in nearly perfect circles. Many researchers believe these alignments reference astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of specific stars. One controversial hypothesis suggests that the site was aligned to Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which would have first become visible on the horizon around 9,300 BCE, precisely when Göbekli Tepe was active. If true, it would mean the builders not only tracked celestial movements, but encoded them into stone, transforming the sky into architecture. The carved foxes and birds that swirl around the pillars could be constellations rendered in mythic form, a prehistoric star map meant to preserve memory when words did not yet exist. To stand among those pillars is to feel the weight of intention. These were not random stones placed by a nomadic tribe. They were shaped, aligned, and erected according to principles that seem both scientific and sacred. Their surfaces gleam faintly in the sun, and when the wind passes through the enclosure it carries a low, whistling tone, a natural resonance born from the circular design. Some researchers have speculated that the builders understood how sound interacted with space, how vibration and voice could transform ritual into physical experience. The T-pillars themselves, each carved with stylized arms and belts, appear to represent anthropomorphic beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps gods. Their presence is commanding, almost technological in its precision. And yet the greatest mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not its construction, it is its burial. Around 8000 BCE, after more than a millennium of use, the entire complex was intentionally entombed. The people who built it filled the enclosures with earth, limestone rubble and debris, sealing them completely. It was not a collapse nor an accident of time. It was a deliberate act, as though someone wanted to hide the site, not destroy it. When Klaus Schmidt first uncovered this, he remarked that it felt like they wanted it preserved. Layer upon layer of backfill, compacted and deliberate, entombed the site so thoroughly that it survived almost untouched for 10,000 years. Whoever buried Göbekli Tepe seemed to know that what they were protecting was not meant for their own age, but for another. The precision of its construction raises questions about the builders themselves. According to conventional history, this was a time of small hunter-gatherer bands, scattered and mobile, lacking agriculture or permanent settlements. Yet Göbekli Tepe required organisation on a massive scale. Quarries, transportation networks, labour coordination and architectural planning. Someone designed it. Someone directed the work. But no trace of domestic life, no houses, no hearths, no storage jars has been found nearby. This was not a village. It was a project, a sanctuary built by people who gathered here for a purpose beyond survival. Some archaeologists argue that Göbekli Tepe was a catalyst, that its construction spurred the birth of agriculture, forcing people to cooperate, settle, and plan for future gatherings. Others see it differently, as the last flowering of a civilization that had already mastered such organisation, and that chose to encode its memory in stone before fading from history. In this view, Göbekli Tepe was not the beginning of civilization, but the final archive of one that came before, a monument to survival, built by people who remembered the world before the flood. The carvings themselves may hint at that memory. On one pillar, a vulture carries a sphere above a headless human figure. On another, scorpions, snakes, and foxes intertwine in chaotic scenes. Some see in these carvings the echoes of catastrophe, the sky breaking open, fire and flood, constellation shifting. Researchers have even connected specific carvings to astronomical events around 10,950 BCE, corresponding to the Younger Dryas impact, the same cataclysmic period of sudden cooling and mass extinction recorded in ice cores. If those carvings are symbolic records of a cosmic event, then Göbekli Tepe is more than ritual, it is testimony. Still, caution dominates the academic field. Without written records, we can only infer purpose from pattern. Critics warn against reading too much into alignments or carvings, noting that humans everywhere are drawn to symmetry and story. They argue that Göbekli Tepe's meaning may have been purely spiritual, a communal site for feasting, ceremony, or mythic renewal. But even those skeptics admit the site's sophistication is astonishing. To reach that level of organisation, the builders must have shared not only belief, but knowledge of geometry, engineering, and the cycles of the heavens. The sense of preservation is what makes Göbekli Tepe so distinct. While later civilizations built upward toward the sky, Göbekli Tepe's builders eventually buried their achievement, turning the hill into a time capsule. It's as if they sensed instability approaching, a climatic collapse, a loss of memory, and chose to protect what they knew by hiding it in plain sight. Buried structures endure. Floods erase surface settlements but not sealed enclosures. Perhaps they had seen the world end once already and refused to let its memory vanish again. Klaus Schmidt often described the site as a library without books, a cathedral of data whose information is written in symbol and proportion. Each animal carving might encode not myth, but measurement, seasons, migrations, star cycles. The site's orientation suggests an early awareness of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars over millennia. To track such motion requires observation across generations, implying that Göbekli Tepe's builders were not wandering bands, but communities devoted to long-term knowledge preservation. Picture a dig worker crouched beside one of those ancient pillars. The sun has just cleared the horizon, and the air is cool, still damp with night. She brushes fine dust from the carved back of a fox, tracing its sleek outline with a gloved finger. The animal seems alive in the stone, its fur rippling beneath her brush. For a moment, she feels as though she's brushing dust not from rock, but from memory itself. Memory that has slept for 12,000 years. Behind her, the hillside hums softly in the wind, the low resonance of air moving through excavated enclosures that once heard chanting, song, and the rhythm of drums. The stones remember sound, and in the right light, even the shadows seem to move with purpose. There's a quiet consensus among those who've worked there. Göbekli Tepe doesn't just belong to human history, it rewrites it. Its very existence forces us to reconsider the timeline of knowledge. If hunter-gatherers built monuments before agriculture, then the spark of complex thought, coordination, and engineering must have existed earlier than we ever imagined. Some scholars call it a cognitive revolution, but others whisper that it feels like a reconstruction, as if knowledge had survived from an older world and found its first rebirth here, in stone. This idea resonates deeply with the greater pattern across ancient sites. The precision seen at Göbekli Tepe, its circular enclosures, aligned pillars, and repeating animal motifs, echoes the harmonic geometry found millennia later in the ziggurats of Sumer and the pyramids of Egypt. It's as though the same seed of understanding planted in a forgotten epoch sprouted again and again in different soils. Even the idea of the sacred mountain, the artificial hill linking heaven and earth, begins here at Göbekli Tepe's summit and continues in every temple tower built afterward. The continuity suggests that Göbekli Tepe may have acted as the first node in the ancient grid, a memory anchor for the survivors of a lost age. The burial then wasn't abandonment, it was a reset. By concealing their masterpiece, the builders ensured it would endure the next upheaval. Thousands of years later, when Sumer's engineers began carving canals and ziggurats, they may have done so guided by the distant echo of a design philosophy already ancient in their day. If Sumer represents the reboot of civilization, then Göbekli Tepe is the hard drive they never erased, the deep archive of a world that fell silent and was reborn. Its pillars, frozen mid-story, still transmit that silence like a low-frequency humming beneath history. Every fox, vulture, and serpent carved there may represent not a god, but a line of code, an instruction set meant to preserve the rhythms of nature, the cycles of stars, and the geometry of survival. Critics argue this is romantic speculation, the human tendency to impose narrative where none exists, and perhaps they're right. But even they cannot explain why a pre-agricultural society would spend centuries building something so advanced, only to bury it whole. To most civilizations, memory is preserved through use. To Göbekli Tepe's builders, preservation meant concealment. That choice feels deliberate, intelligent, almost desperate. Perhaps they saw what was coming. The Younger Dryas had ended only a few centuries earlier. The Earth was unstable, climate patterns shifted violently, seas rose, fires scarred the sky. If these people were the descendants of survivors, if they carried the last knowledge of a lost world, they may have realized how fragile memory could be. So they built their archive from stone and sealed it beneath the earth, trusting that someday someone would find it again. Today, as excavators peel back the layers, the site is literally reawakening. New enclosures are uncovered each year, each more complex than the last. Beneath the already monumental circles lie older ones, untouched for 12,000 years. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more advanced the architecture becomes, an inversion of expected progress, suggesting that the earliest builders were the most skilled. It's as if knowledge was declining over time, not advancing. a pattern that echoes the legend of a lost golden age that fell into forgetfulness. As the day ends, the sun dips low behind the hill, casting long shadows across the open enclosures. The pillars glow faintly, their carvings turning amber in the fading light. For a moment they resemble a frozen congregation, silent witnesses to a story half erased. One can't help but imagine the moment when the builders sealed this place, standing on the rim of their own creation, watching the last light fade before shoveling earth over the stones. Did they weep? Did they chant? Did they whisper to those who might someday find it? Göbekli Tepe remains a riddle carved in limestone, a bridge between myth and measurement. To the cautious scholar, it is a temple without text. To the dreamer, it is a time capsule from a world that refused to die. Whatever its true purpose, it stands as the first monument to memory itself, a prelude to all that followed, a foundation stone for every civilization that would rise from its shadow. And if Sumer's priests later rebuilt the world through writing and number, perhaps they were only decoding what Göbekli Tepe had already stored, in stone, in geometry, in the silent music of its pillars. The whisper that began here would echo for thousands of years, resurfacing in the flood myths, in the Me tablets, in the ziggurats aligned to the stars, because before there were scribes to write and kings to rule, there were builders who remembered, and they left their memory buried in the earth, waiting for the day the world would be ready to remember it again. In a warm clay-walled room near the temple of Nana, the god of the moon, a young scribe bends over a fresh tablet. The air is thick with dust and lamplight. Through a narrow slit in the wall, the last light of dusk fades into indigo. He waits. When Venus appears, bright and sharp above the horizon, he notes its position, angle and time. With a reed stylus, he presses wedge marks into soft clay, a pattern of numbers, symbols, and spaces so precise that a single misplaced stroke could shift the heavens on paper. Behind him, an older master watches closely, correcting a line here, adjusting a fraction there. An error, he murmurs, moves the moon by a day. This is not poetry, it is calibration. These scribes of Sumer, and later Babylon, were the first astronomers of record, turning sky-watching into data. Long before telescopes, they built the foundations of astronomy, through nothing but naked eyes, clay, and relentless discipline. What they produced were not vague omens or idle stargazing. They were systematic observations, daily, monthly, yearly, of planets, eclipses, and celestial cycles tracked over centuries. Their tablets, many recovered from the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, form a continuous record of the heavens stretching back more than 4,000 years. And though they wrote for kings and priests, the deeper story they tell is one of obsession. The attempt to rebuild a cosmic clock that had once synchronized an entire world. The most famous of these is the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, a Babylonian copy of earlier Sumerian records that tracked the rising and setting of Venus for 21 years. Each line notes the exact day Venus first appears as a morning star, the day it vanishes, and the interval between its phases. To modern astronomers, these cycles align so closely with the real motion of Venus that the data can be used to date the observations to within decades. This was not astrology, it was science under pressure, a civilization racing to reconstruct time itself. Why such urgency? The Sumerians already divided time with remarkable precision. Their sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, organised both their mathematics and their concept of the cosmos. 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, 12 months in a year. These conventions that define modern life descend directly from Sumerian metrology. Each value wasn't arbitrary, it reflected the cyclical logic of the heavens. 60 divides evenly into the most recurring astronomical ratios, days, lunar cycles, and planetary periods. It was quite literally a mathematical language built to mirror the universe. Inside temple schools known as adubus, young scribes were trained for years before being entrusted with these calculations. They copied multiplication tables, reciprocal lists, and angle measures until the numbers imprinted themselves into muscle memory. The base 60 system demanded precision. It was unforgiving but elegant. A single wedge in the wrong place could corrupt an entire calculation. The temple's chief astronomer, usually a high priest, would check each entry. Their errors weren't academic, they had cosmic weight. Rituals, planting seasons, royal calendars, even war campaigns depended on celestial timing. A misrecorded Venus rising could disrupt the sacred schedule of the state. But even accounting for practical necessity, the depth of precision in these records goes far beyond what crops or ceremonies required. The Venus tablet cycle spans 8 years, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and Sun. The scribes tracked this not just once, but repeatedly across generations. They also documented lunar eclipses, solar events, and planetary conjunctions with consistent mathematical notation. Some tablets show predictions of eclipses accurate to within a few hours. For a society with no clocks, that level of precision is astonishing. So what were they really doing? Some scholars argue it was all about ritual timing, keeping the gods appeased through correct celestial observance. Others, however, see something deeper, an archival impulse. The same instinct that drove the builders of ziggurats and the keepers of temple libraries. These astronomers weren't just recording, they were reconstructing. After the floods, after the collapse of whatever came before, they were rebuilding the great celestial map piece by piece. To them, watching Venus wasn't superstition, it was preservation. Venus in particular held special meaning. Known to the Sumerians as Inanna and to later Babylonians as Ishtar, she was both goddess and planet, a symbol of rebirth, love, and destruction. Her disappearance and return mirrored the cycles of flood and drought, life and death. Tracking her path was like listening to the pulse of the world, but to the scribes, her movements also offered something else, a way to align human time with cosmic order. Venus's 8-year cycle synced elegantly with the solar and lunar calendars, allowing the priest to reconcile the discrepancies between them. In a world still recovering from chaos, this synchronization was a kind of healing. Even the tools they used reflected that synthesis of ritual and science. Temple observatories were often built with narrow slits or notches that framed specific stars at solstice or equinox. In Uruk, one wall was aligned so that the first light of dawn passed through a slit and struck a carved mark at precisely the right moment, what we might now call a heliacal rising marker. To the untrained eye, it was a religious gesture. To the scribes, it was a measuring instrument. Over time, these measurements produced a body of data so vast that later civilizations, Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, would depend on it. The astronomical diaries, discovered in the ruins of Babylon, contain nightly skylogs spanning centuries, recording everything from planetary positions to weather and grain prices. Even today, NASA scientists studying ancient eclipse paths reference Babylonian data to correct modern models. The numbers hold up. They are still accurate. It's here that the story deepens from mere history to something like continuity. The Sumerian scribes did not treat their tablets as disposable. Each was catalogued, indexed, and stored in temple archives. When kings rose and fell, the records remained. Even after cities burned, new scribes recopied the data line by line onto fresh clay. They were, in effect, maintaining an ancient data server, a clay-based network of astronomical memory. Imagine that warm room again. The scent of clay and lamp oil, the rustle of styluses over damp tablets. A student struggles with a conversion from lunar months to solar years, hesitating before pressing a wedge. His teacher reminds him that each number connects heaven and earth. These weren't abstractions, they were coordinates in a living system, an attempt to keep the world in phase with itself. Critics today argue for simpler explanations. To them, this precision was born of necessity. Irrigation calendars, festival cycles, and taxation schedules required accurate timekeeping. The rest, they say, is embellishment, pre-stressing practicality in divine language. But the uniformity and endurance of these systems suggest otherwise. The same sexagesimal math appears across distant city-states, unchanged for millennia, as if standardized by unseen consensus. The same star catalogues reappear in later empires, slightly updated but never reinvented. These were not spontaneous cultural coincidences. They were legacy systems, maintained with reverence. Supporters of the preservation theory propose that Sumer's scribes were reconstructing a clock, a celestial framework that predated their civilization. Their precision, their insistence on round numbers and cyclical harmony, hints at an older schema they were trying to recover. The base 60 structure, for example, divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, ideal for measuring ratios of planetary motion. It's not an intuitive choice for counting livestock or taxes. It's a system optimized for the sky. In this view, each tablet was a node in a grand experiment, the recreation of a synchronized Earth-sky interface. When the floods of the Younger Dryas had erased everything physical, only the stars remained constant. Rebuilding time itself became humanity's way of regaining control. And so, in those small temple rooms, under oil lamps and open sky, the first scientists rebuilt the calendar of the gods from scratch. One can imagine the emotional weight of that work. To look up every night, knowing your world had once fallen apart, and to see the heavens as the only steady guide, it must have felt like mapping both the cosmos and memory. Each observation was an act of faith that the universe was still intelligible, still ordered. The scribes were not merely recording Venus, they were proving that order could return. Their success echoes through every clock, calendar, and compass that followed. The Babylonians would later refine these observations into predictive models, tables that forecasted eclipses centuries in advance. The Greeks would inherit their sexagesimal angles. The modern hour, minute, and degree are direct descendants of those wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. The system never broke, it was simply translated, evolving from temple to tablet to computer. Today, when we divide a circle into 360 degrees, or watch Venus rise in the dawn, we're participating in that same lineage. The Sumerian scribes built the first data infrastructure of civilization, redundant, decentralized, self-correcting. Their archives survived floods, conquests, and millennia. Clay, it turned out, was a perfect medium, fireproof, stable, and nearly eternal. In a poetic twist, their technology outlasted ours. While modern servers decay in decades, those tablets still whisper through museum glass, still legible in the right light. The connection between their task and ours is hard to ignore. The Sumerian scribe inscribing the position of Venus on wet clay, and the modern astrophysicist logging telescope data onto a digital drive are performing the same ritual, transforming fleeting light into lasting record. Both seek precision, both fear loss, both believe in preservation as salvation. The only difference is the medium. Clay was their silicon, temples were their observatories, and so, when we ask why they cared so deeply, why they pressed the heavens into clay with such devotion, it may be because they remembered what forgetting cost. Civilization, in their view, had already fallen once. To prevent it from happening again, they built their backup not in machines but in numbers and stars. The master scribe looks up from his work. Venus has set. He wipes the stylus clean, places the tablet carefully in a drying rack, and marks its edge with a catalogue number. One of hundreds that will fill the temple shelves. Outside, the night deepens over the ziggurat, and the city hums with quiet life. The stars shift fractionally, invisible to the human eye but measured precisely in clay. They believed, perhaps rightly, that if they could track the sky perfectly, the world below would never fall out of sync again. The clay tablets became the server racks of a recovering world, preserving data through apocalypse, flood, and time. They were the first digital archives. Only their digits were human fingers pressing into clay. And if the first dawn of civilization was a reboot, if these astronomers were truly rebuilding what had once been lost, then perhaps our own glowing screens, our satellites, our digital grids are just another iteration of the same impulse, the eternal human urge to remember the sky before it disappears. We are still pressing light into tablets, still rebuilding the clock, still hoping that this time will keep the signal from fading. If Sumer was not the beginning but the restart node on a broken grid, then history may not be a straight line at all. It may be a circuit. Every few thousand years the current falters, a great flood, a collapse, a silence. Then, somewhere, the light flickers back on. People begin again, measuring the stars, stacking the stones, writing the numbers that make the sky predictable. What we call progress might just be reconnection, the slow reassembly of a system that once stretched across the world. It's tempting to think we've broken free of that cycle, to believe that electricity, satellites and fibre optic lines mark the summit of human invention. But look closer, and the pattern hums beneath everything. Our power grids mirror the old ones, our cities pulse with synchronized light, our servers hold our knowledge the way ziggurats once did, tall, humming archives of data and devotion. We still chase precision, still worship connection, still build monuments to memory. And just like the Sumerian scribes before us, we record everything in the hope that the next fall won't erase it all. So maybe that's the quiet revelation at the end of this story, that we're not the first civilization to map the world with circuits of light, nor the last to risk watching them go dark. The people of Sumer pressed their survival into clay. We press ours into code. Both are fragile in different ways, both are prayers to endurance. If the power faded tomorrow, if the screens blinked out and the world went quiet, what piece of our story would you write in clay? What knowledge would you choose to save for whoever comes next? Keep your mind open, but keep your skepticism close. Share where you're listening from tonight, and what you would preserve if the lights went out. For now, the night is still. The old towers hold their lines. The data hums softly beneath the surface, whispering the same ancient question through every age. What would we rebuild first? And who would remember how?